Welcome to the Health Trip Podcast. My name is Jill Foose. I'm a functional medicine and integrative nutrition health coach. I created this podcast to bring you along as we travel down intriguing, science packed roads, debunking old medical paradigms and perusing new innovative therapies and modalities with the finest functional medicine doctors, practitioners, and like minded biohackers while living our best life. Enjoy the show. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Health Trip Podcast. I am continuing my quest to create a buffet of sexual pleasure options and resources for all of you. And me too. Sexual pleasure hits hard in midlife, and it's important to attend to your vagina and vulva, making sure that it's conducive to pleasurable sex. And I've done other podcasts on menopause hormone therapy and non-hormonal options, so go check those out. And in case you didn't know, the American Urology Association released its 2025 guidelines for using vaginal estrogen, which is a fantastic resource to print out and bring to your next doctor visit to discuss your options. That being said, the other area of sexual pleasure to focus on is your brain. The brain is essential for desire. It's the primary sex organ when it comes to desire, arousal, and pleasure, especially in women. My guest today is Dr. Emily Jamea, a nationally recognized sex and relationship therapist, researcher, and the author of Anatomy of Desire. With a PhD in clinical sexology and over 15 years of experience in the field, Dr. Jamea combines cutting-edge science with deep compassion to help people unlock their full potential for their intimate lives. Dr. Emily Jamea integrates both science and somatic awareness in her approach to cultivating flow states, especially when it comes to sexual desire, intimacy, and emotional connection. While she draws from research in psychology and sex therapy, she applies it to embodied sexual and relational experiences. Whether she's working with couples, leading retreats, or speaking on national media outlets, Dr. Jamea is a powerful advocate for the idea that sexual health is central to overall health. And in today's episode, she'll help us unpack how desire shifts during menopause and how women can reconnect with their bodies, redefine pleasure on their terms, and rediscover the joy of intimacy at any age. Just a short medical disclaimer before we dive in. By listening to this podcast, you agree not to use this podcast as medical advice or to make any lifestyle changes to treat any medical condition in yourself or others. Consult your physician for any medical issues that you may be having. And this entire disclaimer also applies to any of my guests on my podcast. So sit back, open your mind, and let's dig in to flow state. Well, hi, Emily. Welcome to the Health Trip Podcast.
Hi, Jill. I am so happy to be here with you today.
I am happy to have you here today too, because as you know, midlife sex life hits really hard for a lot of women. And there are some women who are just really stuck in a dark hole and can't get out or afraid to come out. And so I really feel like this conversation is going to be really instrumental in helping them reframe what that sexual vision is for them. I always talk about people need to have a health equation, and it's very individual for all of us. But now I think after doing so much research and talking about this sexual pleasure topic, that we all need a sexual vision as well.
I love that reframe. I think, yes, I am such a proponent of shared vision and shared goals and meaning making as much as possible. And, we know from the research that people who are sexually satisfied live more vibrant lives in many ways. So it really should be a part of most people's general health equation and part of their vision. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. It should be another pillar of health for sure.
Yeah.
So, what inspired you to focus on clinical sexology in the first place and then go on to write your book, The Anatomy of Desire, which, by the way, I loved?
Oh, thank you so much. I mean, it depends how far back you want to go. The short story is I grew up in a small conservative town in Southeast Tennessee. My dad, though, was an OBGYN. So within my
Mm,
household, sex was not taboo. I mean, I heard him talking about everything under the sun when he was on the phone with his patients. But as I entered into adolescence, it quickly became apparent to me that that was not obviously an experience that most of my peers had. And so they started coming to me with questions. And keep in mind, this is kind of pre Google what it is today. It's
Right.
not like it was like back in the times where we were all waiting to check out that book, Are You There, God? It's Me, Margaret, just to get like a little
Right.
snippet of normalcy. And so, I think I was giving sex advice long before I was probably qualified to do so. But fast forward, I was studying psychology and part of my undergraduate training and took a human sexuality elective. And it was really at that time that I realized how deep you can get into someone's psyche by asking questions about how they experience sexuality and how they express themselves sexually. I just think you learn a lot about a person. And it was through that coursework that I just realized how healthy and important and natural it is. Yet how it's still so shrouded in taboo and shame for so many people. And, I really felt, I think, called to help remove some of the stigma around that so that people could, live their lives in a more full and meaningful way.
Yeah, well, thank goodness for people like yourself because, we all grow up with our own family unit, with our own family messaging around sex. And in my family, we were very open about it too. And then my ex-husband and I, we have 5 kids together, and, they're all grown and out of the house, but we made a conscious decision to be very open about the conversation around sex and drugs and alcohol and
Yep.
all the things that people are facing when they're growing up. So I do think that's important, but not everybody gets it. So that's why we're here today.
Yeah.
I think one place to start is to understand desire.
Mm.
And so what is female desire?
Oh, gosh, I don't think we really do ourselves any service to think of female versus male desire necessarily. We just have to think of desire as being kind of a human experience. And what desire is wanting. It's that longing for something. A lot of times people use the word drive in place of desire, like I have a sex
Hmm.
drive.
Hmm.
But it actually doesn't function like a drive the way our drive for hunger or food operates in the brain. So we really can't think of it as a drive the same way we think of like hunger or thirst as a drive, because if you don't eat or drink water, you will die. And at the end of the day, we don't die if we don't have sex. So we have to shift the way we think of it, from a drive to kind of a motivation that we're incentivized to fulfill. And so rather than thinking, and Emily Nagoski does a great job explaining this in her book, but more than thinking of as kind of this internal push toward fulfilling that drive like we would thirst or hunger, it's more of an external pull towards something that's kind of appealing to us. And the reason this is so important is because so many people, and a higher percentage of women, experience what we refer to as responsive desire, meaning that the desire doesn't show up until we feel kind of emotionally connected or attended to by our partners, and then a little bit sexually aroused, which is important for, again, women in particular to know, because oftentimes they're waiting for that more spontaneous, horny feeling,
Yeah.
which, just doesn't show up the way, like if you don't eat for a while, you'll start to feel hungry. That spontaneous kind of longing for desire just doesn't show up in the body the same way for a large percentage of people. And so, again, we have to kind of think of it more as this response to things like emotional connection and the context of our environment. Those things play a big role.
Yeah, I think that's such an important message to send because there are a lot of us out there who still believe in spontaneous sex. And when I really think back on my experience, I don't think anything is really spontaneous sex anymore. If I even think my partner and I are going to engage in sex, I take a shower, I make sure my hair looks good. Even though we live together, I do
Yeah.
certain special things. I put deodorant on, or maybe a
Yeah.
little lip gloss, right? Things I don't normally do, right?
Hmm.
And so I'm creating the vibe for myself to get in the mood, whether it goes down that pathway or not. I'm still planning for it in some way. And I think it's a hard thing to accept in midlife, that doesn't exist anymore, and that responsive sex is now something that we can really dig into and make really super pleasurable.
So true. And I have to give you a gold star for using the word planning because I'm such a stickler for language. And, people get all flustered when we talk about planning sex. And a lot of times they'll use the word scheduling. And I'm like, I don't know. I feel like you schedule a root canal, you plan a party. So I just think
Right.
planning has a more positive connotation. And you're so right. When you look back to when you were dating your partner, it felt very spontaneous,
Yeah.
but like, come on, everybody knew what was going down at the end of the night. And there was a
Right.
lot of positive anticipation and preparation that went into setting the mood, exactly like what you described. And we have to maintain that. For
Yeah.
people who are just waiting around for this spontaneous feeling, they're less likely to have as frequent or satisfying sex because that feeling for a lot of people just isn't going to show up. And so what happens is then maybe it shows up for their partner and they come on to them and then there's this feeling of pressure because you weren't really planning for the moment. And so what I advise people to do when it comes to planning sex is to set aside some time on the calendar once a week to be there as a plan B or a fallback plan if you don't connect at other times, maybe quote unquote more spontaneously or organically at other times, then at least you know what, we prioritize this part of our relationship enough that we're going to set aside some sacred time to meet and just maybe lay in bed together and kind of put our skin on each other's skin. And if it leads to more, great. If not, that's okay too, because there's still benefit in that. And I also remind people you can always cancel your plans if that time rolls around and you are just absolutely, not up for it, you can reschedule. So there's flexibility, but I think that it is really nice to say, "Hey, this is important for me and our relationship and I care enough about this piece of us that I want to set aside the time to make sure that we don't let it fall by the wayside."
Yeah. Another part of this is that when I was younger, and I have talked to my friends about this, and you're just discovering sex, and maybe now you're in your 20s, your early 20s, and a lot of us thought, oh, this is going to be great when we move out of our parents' home, when we're done with college and we have our own place. We can have sex as much and whenever, wherever we want. Like it's going to be a free for all. And then all of a
Yeah.
sudden, you get to that point in your life and you're like, it's not working out that way. And then I used to think after my kids are gone, then my husband and I will be able to engage in sex whenever we want. We won't have to think about their schedules. Of course, we're divorced and we both have new partners, but even with a new partner, you're thinking, okay, now my kids are gone and we have our own place. And,
Yeah.
you know, they only come back for holidays and short weekends.
Mhm.
Why doesn't it happen more often?
Well, several reasons. I think, first and foremost, we have to talk about what's happening during the honeymoon stage of the relationship versus what happens
Mm-hmm.
when that neurochemical high wears off. So in the early stages of a relationship, when you can't keep your hands off each other, the rose colored glasses are on, all is good in the world. And we have this really potent, kind of neurochemical cocktail going on that makes us feel almost addicted to our partner. But what I think is really interesting to keep in mind is that our serotonin levels dip during the honeymoon phase. And this is what makes us so obsessive. So the people who have OCD, for instance, have low serotonin. And so it's an exciting feeling, but also it can be kind of an uncomfortable feeling. And, at the end of the day, that level of neurochemistry isn't sustainable. If we stayed at that level all the time, we'd never get anything done because we'd
Right.
be in bed all day long. And so what happens is it transitions from more of a passive process to an active process. And I
Hmm.
think for so many couples, it falls by the wayside because they don't have the tools or knowledge to know how to maintain it when it's an active process. It's like falling in love versus love as a verb. It's different.
Mm.
It's still love, but the way we use the tool changes. But a lot of people are ill equipped and don't have the information. And so it just seems to kind of disappear.
Yeah, that makes sense. One other thing that hits hard in the menopause transition is body physical changes, emotional changes. our skin changes, our hair changes, everything's just changing. When
Yeah.
we look in the mirror, we don't really see who we saw, 10, 15, 20 years ago. And for some women, that's a really big struggle and a barrier into continuing on their sexual pleasure with their
Mhm.
partner who they've been married to for 30 years, or maybe they're
For
divorced. I'm a
sure.
divorced woman. And so I remember when I was getting divorced, I was in perimenopause and my hair loss was triggered. I
Yeah.
went on oral birth control so I wouldn't get pregnant, thinking I'm going to go out and date. So I had acne on my back, which I'd never had in my life. My skin looked different. Um, I just didn't feel like me. And so
Yeah.
let's talk about some of these barriers and how women can move through those or sit with it and still reach for sexual pleasure.
Sure. It is so hard to stay connected to our sexuality when we're going through really trying times or through times that are turbulent or making us feel different about ourselves. I always tell people your sexuality is like a fingerprint. It is going to be different in some way, shape, or form than anybody else's sexuality,
Mhm.
and it will always be affected by what's happening individually within your relationship and within your environment. So you have to take all of that into consideration. I have a whole chapter on adaptability in my book, and I
Mhm.
draw a lot from Kristen Neff's work on self compassion. I just love her approach. And, there's different components to her model of self compassion, but one of them is kind of over identification with the change. It's really our brain has a tendency to attach to the negative rather
Mhm.
than see all the other things that's good. Or sometimes I'll draw from like Susan David's work on emotional agility, and she poses the question, but what else am I?
Mhm.
Sometimes when we have a problem, it's kind of different ways of same ways, different language of attacking the issue. When we have an issue, sometimes we just all we can see is that issue, or all we feel are, emotions related to that issue. And so mindfulness techniques can go a long way in helping us to step back and take a look at the bigger picture. I also pull from research on like post traumatic growth, which is a really exciting emerging area of research looking at, people who stay stuck in post traumatic stress versus people who grow from difficult experiences. Like, what are they doing different? And
Mhm.
so much of it is about meaning making and their ability to integrate the change into their psyche or into their body in a way that you're not ignoring it, you're not pretending it doesn't exist, but rather than fighting it or getting stuck in your grief around the change, they're able to kind of accept some of it and move forward. And so those are the kinds of things that I often pull from when it comes to just this like, oh my God, looking at myself in the mirror, I can't even, who is this woman?
Right. Yeah, I remember reading maybe it was some research that came out of the Kinsey Institute, and who's there? Justin
Lay
Lay
Miller.
Miller. Yeah, I
Mhm.
think he did something on women who were actually obese,
Mm,
and their image of themselves was, of course, their confidence was very low. They didn't feel sexual. They didn't feel sexy. They didn't feel like their partner wanted them. But then when he interviewed their partners were like, I don't know what she's talking about. Like she's still the
yeah.
most beautiful thing, like it's sexy thing in the world. I love her for who she is. And so
Hmm.
there's this like this gray zone between these two partners, this deep misunderstanding, and that really disconnects them.
Yeah, it's so true. And there was another study they did looking at the difference, in situations where someone was struggling with body image, what the
Mhm.
effect was when their partner told them, hey, no, I'm still attracted to you. I still think you're
Mhm.
beautiful, versus partners who did more physically like touch and caress them and hold them. And they found that that was actually
Hmm.
had a stronger improvement on body image, that physical touch did than the verbal reaffirmation. Another thing that can be helpful is, we don't often see, we're starting to get a little bit more, but I was going to say people in the media, who are middle aged having or older having hot sex. And so sometimes, and it kind of feeds this myth that sex is for the young and able bodied. And so sometimes what we recommend is looking at porn or erotica of people who look more like you, and
Mhm.
starting to kind of identify more with, hey, these are people whose, skin is starting to sag a little bit, or they're carrying a bit more weight around the midsection or whatever it may be. And to see them still embracing and leaning into their sexuality can help give ourselves permission to do the same.
I am so glad that you brought up looking at pornography because I try to talk about that to my clients or to groups of women, to other people I have on my podcast. And
Mhm.
there's still a lot of pushback, but there is some
Mhm.
amazing women centric produced porn. Obviously, women still want it because it's still out there.
Yeah.
And it's now being even more produced for women by
Mhm.
women. And
Mhm.
so, who is porn good for? Is it good for all of us? Should we all engage in that? Do we need to tiptoe around this subject? Why is it still so taboo?
I don't think we need to tiptoe around it. As far as who it's good for, I mean, the great thing about it is there is something out there for just about everybody
Oh, yeah.
nowadays, and it really has helped people who are maybe in kind of subcultures within the kink community who thought that their kink or fetish was, that they were the only one that had it. And now they can see, hey, there's like a whole porn production that centers around this fetish. I'm not so alone. So I think it's good in that way. And I am all about responsible and ethical porn use. We do need to be mindful of the sites that we go on because, unfortunately, things, of course, still do get filtered in where there could be a sex trafficking situation or someone
Right.
who it says over 18, but they're really not, and you don't know. And so it's good, I think, if you're wanting to view porn, to make sure you're doing so responsibly and ethically. And yes, there are really beautiful production companies out there now who are women run and they're producing for women. Porn is nothing new. Of course, our access to it and what we can find at the click of a mouse is new, but people have been engaging in kinky sex for thousands of years. So, it's we hold a lot of myth and taboo around it, but we've had a curiosity, I think, just kind of innate within us for a long time.
Yeah, this brings me to the subject of communication and how important communication is between partners in terms of wants, desires, needs. So, can you speak to the way in which a couple can communicate with each other about what they want in for their sexual pleasure that they're not
Mhm.
getting today?
Yeah, such a great topic. And I did a whole podcast episode on sexual communication that I think everyone needs to go listen to because it was such a good conversation. But so my advice for someone, for the couple maybe who has never had that conversation is first rule, you don't have it during sex. You don't have it when you're in
Right.
bed and the most vulnerable and raw. That's like a big no-go. It's good to do it when you're maybe out for a walk together because that can take some of that pressure off that like sitting awkwardly across
Mhm.
the table. And the way you start the conversation is by saying the following. I have had some thoughts and feelings about things that I am interested in trying sexually, or I've been reflecting on our sex life. And the truth is, I feel so uncomfortable and awkward sharing them with you. But I love you and I trust that you will be open to hearing to what I have to say and be non-judgmental. And I'm just going to go for it. That's how you do it because you people always ask me like how do I have the conversation without it feeling awkward, and I'm like you don't. Like you have it even
Mhm.
though it feels awkward, and you know that by pushing through the awkwardness it's intimacy building. And by making that statement, I know that you're a safe person, I know that you're not going to judge me. It's a bit manipulative, but you kind of they wanna live up to that. So it lessens the chance that they're gonna, like, be
Right.
shocked by what you have to say because 'cause they're gonna wanna prove, "Yes, of course I'm a safe and trusting, non-judgmental person." And then you always create space and openness to hearing what they have to say as well. Of course, it's always important to balance likes and dislikes, and I think what's really key when talking about sex is the why. So you don't just
Mhm.
stop at I would like more foreplay. You say, I would really love extended foreplay because fill in the blank. Because that gets more into the feeling component. It adds context and it's going to make it more likely that they'll remember what you said.
Mm-hmm. And what happens if you and your partner are not on the same page about what one person wants versus what another person wants?
So here's my kind of take on that. Unless it is something that is just for some reason against your value system or is triggering or re-traumatizing in any way, you want to be a collaborative partner as much as possible, and sometimes that may be stretching yourself a bit, into kind of doing something that maybe it's not your thing, but if it's really special and exciting to your partner, maybe you do it anyway, as long as it's balanced, or as long as it's maybe not every single time you have sex. But like, and it's important, I think, to talk about the difference between a kink and a fetish.
Mm-hmm.
A fetish is someone is dependent on that thing every single time they have sex, usually in order to have an orgasm. A kink, on the other hand, is more of a specific sexual interest that people may enjoy playing around with from time to time. And, so if you're in a new relationship and someone says, "Hey, I have this specific sexual fetish," and it is a turn off for you, don't stay with that person because
Right,
they're
right.
going to be dependent on it.
Yeah,
But if it's something they kind of like, and maybe it's not really your top thing, but hey, you're happy to do it for them every now and then, I say go for it.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I also love that all the things you're saying lead to curiosity. They lead to creativity. And I think that
Mhm.
those are some of the ingredients that might be missing, especially in a long-term relationship when you're married for 20, 30 years, that you might get in a new relationship for a little bit.
Mhm.
So one of the things I love doing with my clients is having them take this VIA character strengths test online, which I'm sure you're
Okay.
familiar with. But it
I'm not
it's
actually.
really so
No.
it's a 10-15 minute test you take online. You answer a series of questions and it spits out all the 20 top character strengths in order of your strength to your weakest ones. And it's those
Mm.
top five that are the most intuitive to you. So it could be
Mhm.
curiosity, honesty, love of learning. I'm looking at mine right now, leadership, self-regulation. So there's all of these character traits. And
Mhm.
since those are the most innate to you and the easiest, and you don't have to think about using them, how can you use those and translate those into your sex life? So if you're someone who's super curious, and you just said the question before, my question is, what else is out there for me? Right.
Mhm.
And your love of learning, well, maybe the love of learning might lead you towards watching women-centric porn or bringing in a vibrator or trying a new position. So there's
Yeah.
all ways to like bring in these top character strengths into your sex life to help you reach your goals.
For sure. We know from the research that novelty is a key predictor
Yeah.
of long-term satisfaction. So, yeah, it's important, I think, to mix things up from time to time. In my chapter on curiosity, I write a lot about the psychology of novelty and why we are curious to try new things. And curiosity has shown to be an adaptive quality. And it's something we're born with. In fact, all of my five qualities are qualities we're born with. 4-year-olds ask an average of 400 questions per day. That
Hmm.
number drops to like two by the time they enter into middle school. So you have to remember that curiosity for most of us is innate, but because of the influence of culture or societal expectations or gender socialization, sometimes we get kind of disconnected from that quality.
Hmm.
Now there are people who are, just predisposed to be more novelty seekers than other who are maybe a bit more comfortable with the status quo. But
Hmm.
let's say you are the person in a relationship who's hungry to learn and interested in trying the new thing. This is where I love pulling from flow state
Hmm.
science. So flow state, one of the most predictable ways of getting into flow is by striking the right balance between challenge and skills. So if you imagine an XY axis where how challenging something is on the Y axis and how skilled you are at that thing is on the X axis. we can get into a flow state, which is that kind of hyper focused surfer at one with the wave in the zone type of feeling,
Mhm.
when the challenge of what we're doing is only 4% greater than our skills. And I think this is really important to keep in mind when trying new things sexually, because what I don't advise people to do is going from like lights off missionary sex to, the 50 shades of gray type of thing right off the
Mhm.
bat. Because what
Yeah.
happens when that difference is too great, we get anxious and feel
Yeah.
inhibited and scared, and that takes over. But when the challenge of what we're doing is too far below our skill set, that's when we slip into boredom and
Yeah.
monotony, and we're not going to get into that hyper focused state. And so this is where I think collaboration really comes into play, and talking with your partner, like, hey, I think we need to shake things up a little bit, going through like a yes, no, maybe list, which I have in the book, and kind of checking off different things that you're interested in trying, things you definitely want to try. You can cross off things you know for sure you don't want to try,
Mhm.
just to get that conversation going. And then you take baby steps. I see this so, I see people make this mistake so much, like when they're wanting to maybe do something like having a threesome. They've
Right.
never done it before. And so they maybe, find someone online and bring them in, and it ruins the relationship, or they ask a friend or something like that. I'm like, that was challenge was way too far above
Right.
skills. Like
Right.
a mid step or a baby step might have been like going to a bar together and one of you flirting with someone at the bar and just seeing how that felt, and then coming home and just digesting that for a few days, and then deciding if you want to take things up a notch from there. But when it comes to sexual exploration, there is so much nuance. I mean, sometimes it's about taking something that is familiar, but making it more psychologically or emotionally interesting in some way. Like, I had a couple, I wish this would have made it into the book, but it was already in editing at that point. But they were kind of that missionary, default couple, and kind of belly to belly looking past each other. She was totally checked out. And so, I'm talking to them about this, and they came back, and he said, what I did last time was I took her hands and kind of pinned them over her head,
Mm. Mhm.
still in the missionary position, but
Right.
that got her attention. That
Oh, yeah.
drew her into the moment. So, very subtle differences sometimes can be just enough to get us in the zone.
Yeah. I want to talk about the 5 pillars of flow state that you talk about in your book. I thought it was just
Mhm.
fascinating. Also, I love that each one of these pillars could be looked at independent of the others. You didn't have
Yeah.
to like check off, okay, I have this one, and this one. Now I'm going to work on number 4. It was sort of
Right.
like they were like stood alone and you could
Yeah.
just focus on one. And I know that mindfulness, if we're talking about the flow state, we can't skip over mindfulness, and that is something that's really helped me this past year. Is and not just in my sex life, but in everything that I do, right? Being
Mhm.
present and in the moment. And that is not easy when you are going through menopause.
No, for sure. I totally get that. Yeah, so flow state, actually there's 8 components of flow. In the research I did when I talked to couples who had high sexual satisfaction who were getting into flow during sex, it was these 5 themes that emerged. And so I weave those flow components through each of the 5 themes, and to just lay them out, it's sensuality, curiosity, adaptability, vulnerability, and attunement. And it's in the sensuality chapter that I talk about mindfulness, but more importantly, about embodiment, because embodiment takes mindfulness a step further. Mindfulness is a wonderful tool. Mindfulness is when you notice the intrusive thought or feeling you're having, you name it, you identify it, and then you pull back emotionally and bring your attention back into your body. But that's sort of a bit of mental gymnastics. It's like, notice, bring attention back. Notice, bring attention back.
Hmm.
It's not going to get you into a flow state alone. When we take it a step further and we're fully embodied and present in the body, we don't really have those intrusive thoughts at all. So like embodiment expert Mark Walsh said a quote that I use in the book. He said, in mindfulness is awareness of the body. Embodiment is awareness as the body. And
Mm.
I just think that minor change in preposition really, like, to me, makes embodiment makes sense. People in the research will talk about kind of their bodies almost having a mind of their own because they're
Mhm,
moving
mhm,
in ways that they're not really consciously planning.
mhm.
And that's something I think worth talking a little bit about is when we get into a flow state, we experience this phenomenon referred to as transient hypofrontality, meaning the prefrontal cortex part of the brain, which is where our higher order cognitive skills function, our executive function, rational thinking, decision making, planning, that part of the brain quiets down. And so the monkey brain, the chitter chatter all
Mhm.
goes quiet. So we're not really using more of the brain, we're using less of the brain. And this is such a great tool. I include a story in the book about a woman who had terrible body image issues after having kids. And, once she was finally able to get into a flow state, the body image issues weren't present because that self-consciousness wasn't there anymore once she got into flow. So it's just, I think, worth exploring as a tool to move away from that self-consciousness that can feel so inhibiting.
In talking about sensuality, do you think it's harder for women who don't feel sensual in their daily lives to reach the flow state, to work on this for themselves than it is for someone who walks around and you can sense when someone has a very sensual way about themselves?
I do. So I did 2 studies on this, and I feel very confident in saying yes. I think the more sensual you are in your day-to-day life, the easier it'll be to be sensual when you're in the bedroom. It's a neural pathway that we either, nurture and let grow or we inhibit. And you cannot expect to go from like multitasking and split attention all day long to the singular focus of sex just with the flip of a switch. The brain doesn't work like that. And so I encourage people, especially on days where they're wanting to have better than average sex, to try to slow down and to stay present in their body as much as possible. We don't realize how fried our nervous systems are. Um, I saw a post the other day with someone talking about like seeing foreplay as a way to ground someone rather than a way to excite someone. And I just
Mm,
loved that reframe
yeah.
because I think that's what we probably a lot of us need in order to make that transition, from that like never ending to do list in our head into our body.
Yeah. As a menopausal woman, we're in this, a lot of us are in this sandwich phase in our life. We still might have a kid or two at home or kids in college, and we're always going to be moms, right? And then we also
Mhm.
have elderly parents, aging family members that we might be taking care of. And I describe it for myself. My experience is in my brain, there's all these different rooms, and I have to like leave the laundry room in my brain to go into the kitchen to make dinner, and then I have to leave the kitchen to go into the bedroom. And then how long does it take me in the bedrooms if we planned to have sex
Mhm.
that night? How long does it take for on the average for women to switch that mindset
Yeah.
into leaving their tasks and then now getting into their own body and their own mindset around sexual pleasure?
It's so interesting. When I started hypothesizing about why we're so disconnected from our bodies, I called up one of the first ever sex therapy supervisors I had when I was like a baby sex therapist. And I called her because she, at that time, had retired from seeing clients. She was just supervising. And this would have been in like 2008, 2009. We had smartphones, but I think Instagram had like just come out. So, in other words, we just weren't as app driven. There was no podcasting or anything like that. And, I asked her, I said, "Do you remember people complaining about this inability to quiet?" I called her years later when I was doing this research and writing the book. I said, "Do you remember about your patients complaining about this inability to quiet the mind?" In the way that I'm hearing in the office. And she took a few days to get back to me because she said, "I really wanted to think about it." And she said, "I just don't." She said, we had people, of course, who had body image concerns or men who would worry about losing their erection. But she said, "I just don't remember people talking about like mental load or never ending to-do list or,
Yep.
and it kind of confirmed my hypothesis that nowadays it's like we don't just sit and have lunch, like we check emails at the same time.
Yeah.
We
Yep.
listen to a podcast and we drive, or we work out at the gym and we catch up on the news. Like we're just always doing two, three things at once, and
Yeah.
it's too much for the brain. We know from research on focus that it takes an average of like 12 to 15 minutes to get into a focused state. Most people don't have sex that lasts that long. So,
Right.
you got to kind of think about that. And then we know when our focus gets interrupted, it can take another 25 minutes to get back into a focus state. So
Yeah.
like, just important to keep in mind when you're, using intention to cultivate better sex.
Do you hear women say that they're starting to feel self conscious or a little bit bad that it's taking them longer to either get in the flow, even if they're not in flow state, but just to get into the flow of responsive sex, responsive desire? Um, and also taking too long to reach an orgasm if they're able to reach an orgasm?
Oh, yeah. I mean, I have women just feel guilty about so many things.
Yeah,
And yeah, they feel guilty about how frequently they want sex. They feel guilty about how long it takes them to have an orgasm. For sure, that's an issue. And there is a gap. I mean, biologically, there is a gap. Men have to have a orgasm to expel ejaculate in order to procreate. So it's just easier for them.
right,
Women, as far as we know, there's no like biologic or evolutionary reason aside from incentivizing us to have sex because it feels good, pleasure, but it's not like you have to have an orgasm to have a baby. So it's just harder
right.
for us. And, but there's a lot of misinformation around that, both it's changing now, but a lot of times women thought they should be able to have orgasms through penetration. Biologically that's just not the way most women have orgasms. You can think of the clitoris like a mini penis or the
Right.
penis like a big clitoris. They are essentially the same body part, and so it's about stimulating for most women the clitoris in the right way. And it does on average take longer to get in, out of the head and into the body. Women require more focus typically in order to have an orgasm, which is why vibrators are so wonderful because it kind of helps speed things along. But I'm also like, use a vibrator, great, all for it, especially postmenopausal women. Orgasmic consistency declines and vibrators
Yeah.
can come in, really handy. But also, coach your partner on how to just stay in the moment. Like, why do we want to rush through the experience if it's a good experience? I mean, do you want to like scarf down fast food on the road, or do you want to like savor, a well-prepared meal? Do you want to dip your toe in and out of the bathtub, or do you want to like luxuriate in bubbles and a candle? Like let's just kind of enjoy sex a little bit longer. Like what's the problem?
I think this is where self pleasure or masturbation really comes into play, really learning, the tempo and the speed of which you need for yourself. What do you like?
Mhm.
And then how can you communicate that to your partner, like we were talking about? So I think that,
Mhm.
a lot of women have a lot of shame around masturbation, or they don't have, haven't had a good experience around masturbation. And I
Yeah.
also think that our moms didn't talk to us about this. My mom
Mm-mm.
did not at all.
Yeah.
I made sure that that was different. I have four boys and a girl, and I made sure when my daughter went to college, and even in high school, we talked about it. I bought her
Yeah.
first vibrator, and I said, "You
Yeah.
have to learn how to pleasure yourself and what works
Mhm.
and what doesn't work, and then you have to learn how to communicate that to your boyfriend."
Right.
And it's such a gift to be able to hand that down to our younger generation.
For sure. I mean, I think parents do their kids such a disservice when they don't give them permission to explore
Yeah.
their bodies and to masturbate, because it's the safest thing they can do to experience, sexual pleasure. And if they're having that kind of built up tension, they don't have to turn to a partner where they run the risk of pregnancy or STDs. They can
Yeah.
just, turn inwards. So, yeah, I wish parents would do a better job.
Yeah. You
like you
have a
did.
whole, yeah, well, thank you. You have a whole chapter on vulnerability, and this is one of those
Mhm.
pillars or themes. Speak to vulnerability because there are so many women who, maybe they're finding themselves divorced or widowed, or they're just single and haven't been in a long-term relationship. Um, and even women who are in a long-term relationship, going through menopause has made them feel more self-conscious. And so, how does
Mhm.
vulnerability fit into this equation for us?
Yeah, so many people like just reduce sex down to a juxtaposition of body parts and don't really tap into the emotional world that exists within the sexual realm. And there's so much to explore there. We cannot separate our individuality from our sexuality. It's not like our sex life like lives in this box separate from everything else. And when we hide parts of ourselves, when we don't make ourselves completely known to our partner, we're not bringing 100% of us into the bedroom.
Mm,
We're just not going to show up in the same way, I think, than we do when like everything is out there on the table. And we're willing to be vulnerable and we have that safety and security. One of the studies I did looked at the relationship between sensuality and curiosity and those qualities as it relates to sexual satisfaction. And I found that people who were highly sensual and highly curious tended to be more sexually satisfied, but only if they also had a secure relationship with their partner.
mhm,
So, you could be the most sensual, curious person in the world. If you were feeling insecure in your relationship for any reason, or if you had more of like an avoidant attachment style and were kind of emotionally shut down, the sexual satisfaction scores dropped.
hmm,
So feeling, safe enough to be seen for all that you are, the good, the bad, and the ugly, is a really important foundation for great sex. It's like, you can only let go and enjoy the roller coaster and put your hands up if you know you're securely strapped in. And the
yeah.
same principle applies here. And so that's what the vulnerability chapter is all about.
So I hear you saying that, and I'm thinking about women who get divorced in midlife and how I feel like safety kind of goes out the door in a way. They
Yeah.
they become like really sexually active. They have a huge sex drive.
Oh,
They're
mhm.
really horny, and they become less concerned about safety because they're not looking for a relationship right out of
Yeah.
where they just left. So how does that all sort of play out? What do you attribute that to?
I say more power to them. It's an opportunity to explore their
Hmm.
sexuality maybe in a way that they just couldn't do, for various
Hmm.
reasons with the person who they were in a longer term relationship with or who they were divorced from. And if you think about you're with one person for a long period of time and you end up getting divorced, we can assume that there's been probably a few years that things have been unhappy and you've felt maybe emotionally neglected or sexually neglected. And it's not like our desire just dies. Like it's in there. It's just not there for that person. And so then when
Right.
that person's out of the picture, it's like Pandora's box and everything comes out. And I think women, past a certain age into their 40s and 50s just feel so much more secure in who they are. And so it's a really exciting headspace to be in, I think, for sexual exploration versus when you're in your 20s and you have no idea who you are, how to set boundaries, or how to assert yourself, or talk about what you like. Like, we're much more self assured over the
Hmm.
age of 40.
Yeah.
And so I think it's a wonderful opportunity to explore. I mean, I still encourage people to do it safely and
Yeah.
responsibly, but yeah, I mean, some women go a little bit wild after a divorce, and I think it's great. I don't
It's what's so interesting to me about this topic is that women who are married and in long-term relationships, and I'm totally generalizing, right? But there
Mm,
is a group of women who lose their libido.
mhm,
We have vaginal dryness. So arousal becomes a challenge.
mhm.
But that same age group of women who are divorced don't have those issues. Some do, but
Mm,
there's a
yeah.
group that don't. And it's just really interesting to me how being out of a relationship that wasn't working for you um, sort of gets you excited and aroused, and you don't feel those symptoms of GSM, genital urinary of menopause, right? We don't feel that
Yeah.
vaginal dryness. The lubrication is just flowing and our
Mhm.
brain is on fire. Um, so
It's
that, isn't that
so
interesting?
true. It's so true. And it just goes to show you how contextual our
Mm,
sexuality is. I mean,
yeah,
context is everything. And yeah, so many people come through my office who are like, I have no interest in sex. And I'm like, are you sure you have no interest in sex or you just don't have interest in him? There's a
right,
big difference.
right,
And I think that's what so many women are realizing is it wasn't that they weren't interested in sex, they just weren't interested in sex with their partner. And so
right.
once that person's out of the picture, they're able to get back in touch and reinvigorated in a really exciting way.
Right, because they get that creativity to create a new story, a new
Yeah,
scenario for yourself. You're not going to be judged by the person you've been with for 23 years. Yeah,
right.
there's a lot of freedom in that. Another theme you talk about is attunement, which I found was also very, very interesting. Can you
Yeah.
speak to what attunement is?
Yeah. So attunement, if I had to whittle it down to one word, it would be synchrony. So,
Mm,
attunement is kind of the gestalt of the other four themes. I would say the other four secrets. And the analogy I often use is like a pair of ballroom dancers who have been dancing together for years. They appear to glide as one unit across the dance floor. And
hmm.
she knows what a flick of his wrist is signaling her body to do, or she may look at him in a certain way, signaling him to start a new combination. So they've got a very unspoken language and chemistry and synchrony that only comes with a lot of time together and practice and dedication. And so, we hear so much about sexual communication. And while obviously that's important, I really want to take people beyond the verbal communication and teach them how to communicate non-verbally,
Mm,
so that you can just kind of go quiet and let your bodies do the talking. And it's only then I think that we experience that sense of merger, that like sum is greater than the parts feeling that so many of us long for. People who describe sex as being kind of clunky or awkward, and of course that's going to happen. We're not going to like have that sense where everything clicks every single time. But I do think, it's less likely to happen if you're not having sex very often, and that's with anything. You're not going to get
right.
into a flow state if you only, pick up your violin once a year. I mean, you're gonna have to kind of go through that struggle phase all over again. And so, this is where practice comes into play. It's where we, that quality time. So, Bridget Feinhardt's research is really interesting on physiological synchrony. Our nervous systems, when we're in proximity to our partner, can kind of sync up.
Hmm.
And female bodies tend to actually follow kind of the male nervous system's rhythms more so than the reverse. And
Hmm.
most likely that's due to gender socialization and women having to kind of accommodate people around
Yeah.
them, unfortunately. But it's also, I think, a good tool to keep in mind. If you're living like two ships passing in the night and you don't have that time together where you're uninterrupted and really engaged, and I'm not even talking about it in the bedroom, but just to sit down and have a conversation, you're less likely to get into that synchrony when you do make love because you're, just not as synced in other areas of your life. And so, there's a lot of kind of hacks and tools that I write about that people can use to help create that sense of attunement.
Once a couple or partners reach a state of flow and they've got it down, and now it's something that they can experience
Mhm.
together on a regular basis, does that then reach boredom, a state of boredom where now they have to take it up another level?
I don't think so. Not
Mm,
necessarily. No. I mean, it's looking for the nuance, which I think if we look hard enough, we'll always find. I write about things like rather than thinking about the new thing you want to do, like think about how you want to feel. Do you
mm,
want to feel playful? Do you want to feel romantic? Do you want to experiment with a power play. Like, what are you wanting emotionally? There's always going to be subtleties because we are living, breathing organisms. Our
Right.
relationships are living, breathing organisms. The way we connected early on is going to be different at different seasons in life. And so I think when we stay really curious about ourselves and our partner, and we continue to evolve and we lean into the evolution, it's going to feel in many ways different, um, than it would if I don't think it's ever really static.
Yeah. Well, Emily, what an amazing conversation. I know that so many women listening will have so many golden nuggets to walk away from and think about and consider to try for themselves.
Mhm.
Before we leave, what are three things though that a woman listening right now at home can do just to help her reframe her sexual pleasure?
Mm, I think the first thing for women in particular is to slow down where you can.
Mm,
We are just so overstretched and overcommitted. So try to slow down where you can, ground yourself, get into nature. Those kinds of things can do a lot to help calm the nervous system, which is really important. The second thing I would say is give yourself permission to explore, to feel pleasure. I don't think many women realize how inhibited they still feel. So
yeah.
sometimes it's a lot of like unlearning, that we have to do to kind of make that happen. And then the third thing I would say is, have conversations with your partner so that, you don't want to think of sex as like your needs versus their needs. As much as possible, you're collaborators, you're on the same team, come up with goals together and then take steps toward them. Involve your partner in the process.
Yeah, I love that. I'm going to add a number four, which is read your book because it really,
Yes.
oh yeah, it's
Thank
called
you.
Anatomy of Desire. It really opens up your mind to really thinking about things very much differently. And
Mhm.
if getting into the flow state is a goal of yours.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Emily. What a wonderful, uh, educational conversation. And I really appreciate your time coming on to the Health Trip podcast.
My pleasure.
All right. And thanks for tuning in, everyone. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the podcast. Lifestyle changes can be hard and overwhelming to make. By building your support team of functional medicine doctors, therapists, and health coaches, you can reach your optimal health goals. Be sure to check out my other podcasts. Until we meet again, stay healthy.